This tutorial is about political parties and how they function, their structures and various key components, characteristics of parties that we can use to analyze how we can expect them to behave in democracies and elsewhere. So first of all, what are they about? Basically, they separate political candidates based on ideologies, political positioning, and goals for the political system as a whole. They first appeared as a way to get voters active and involved, so very much came out of the democratization process in Western Europe and North America. They have a few primary functions. One of them is recruitment. They bring new voters to the political process, but they also bring new politicians into the political process. A lot of people who want to run for office get their schooling within the party on how to do it, and also key infrastructure and support when they want to run for office. So they recruit both the voters and the politicians. They do educate voters about issues because they aggregate the issues, distill the issues from the highly complex everyday machinery of governance down to a more digestible presentation that makes it easier to understand the issues at hand for voters. Sometimes, of course, political parties oversimplify things, and that's another discussion. But ideally, they will make politics more accessible for the voter. Also, to demonstrate to government and parliament and governance what the preferences of the citizens are. Since they mobilize citizens, that's a way for the political parties to influence the programs of government. Now, there's different ways of categorizing parties. We can talk about how they aggregate and articulate interests. The way they collect and express interests affects how they design their election platforms. So programmatic parties are more ideological, you could say. They're parties that are more explicitly cleaving to a particular comprehensive ideology. It could be socialism or liberalism or conservatism, but they tend to be much more ideologically pure, and in some cases they can be seen as representatives of the social classes, for instance. I've put Canadian examples here. NDP, which is a social democratic party. It's a smaller, traditionally, party in Canadian politics. And that's also a characteristic of programmatic parties. They tend to be smaller because they focus more on their ideology. That's the core voters, if you will. Same thing with the Greens. They tend to be smaller in most democracies, precisely because they focus more on the ideological purity of their particular ism. Another type of party is the brokerage or umbrella party. These parties try to be big tent parties, big umbrella parties that bring together voters that might have more varied interest than you will see in programmatic parties, more factions, wider range of ideological positioning, maybe factions that don't always see eye to eye. They're more election oriented, more election machine, you could say. They're created as a way for these different factions to have an infrastructure to mobilize for an election, basically. And they focus more on specific issues rather than the larger ideological questions. They also tend to avoid hot button issues and position themselves much more vaguely to appeal to a larger group of centrists, if you will. And they try to appeal to more common values and maybe focus more on the party leaders' leadership qualities than explicit ideology. In Canada, we have Liberals and Conservatives, which are the traditional dominant parties that tend to position themselves and structure themselves as brokerage or umbrella parties. That's a way to win elections in Canada. Basically, the biggest parties tend to be those that drift towards brokerage, even though they might have started as programmatic parties. The bigger a party becomes, the more likely it is to become a brokerage party because it has so many different interests to negotiate within the party. So it has to be more about compromise between these different factions. We can also talk about different types of organization. Cadre parties, they have been created and directed by a small elite group, usually a parliamentary group that then extends itself outside of parliament. And they tend to control power within legislatures, and they've been mobilized downwards. So from parliament, they have reached out and tried to mobilize the voters. Again, Canadian examples would be the Conservatives and Liberals. British Tories would probably fit this description quite well as well. So those that have started more as elite parties, and with the advent of democracy, they reach out and try to mobilize voters. Mass parties tend to be those that come from a political social movement that started outside of parliament, and then they mobilized and they gained voter confidence and they entered parliament. So they had an organization when they entered parliament. And so they have that public influence through the power of membership. Social Democrats, very common here, both Canadian NDP and British Labour. Greens are also an example of that, having been formed from the environmental movement and then entered parliament. And then we can talk about militia parties, very centralized systems led by military leaders and so on, typically found in one-party systems and dictatorships. Put here communist parties in China, Cuba, Soviet Union, fascist parties, and so on. So not terribly relevant in democracies. Finally, we can also speak about party systems. And that's a way of labeling the typical day-to-day politics depending on how many parties are likely to get elected and get seats in parliament. We can talk about one-party systems, which is authoritarian dictatorships where only one single party is allowed, China, Cuba, or competitive party systems, which is what we have in democracies. These are political parties that are permitted to compete with one another for the support of the electorate. And there's a real and legitimate chance that more than one party may win power. So who is going to win the election is the question. And you'll typically find that most entrenched democracies have two-party systems or multi-party systems, depending on which electoral system they have. And in the two-party system, it's basically which of the two parties is going to win the next election. So you'll have, in a parliamentary democracy, you will have two clear candidates that are the obvious choices for prime minister, for instance. So in the UK, for instance, you would typically look for a Labour or Tory prime minister. Those are the two primary parties competing. In the US, you have a two-party system between Democrats and Republicans. Those are the only candidates that have any realistic chance of winning the more significant political offices from president and Congress and so on. But a whole lot of countries have party systems with more than two parties, and those are called multi-party systems. We see that in most European countries, Sweden, Germany, Italy, and so on and so forth. Now, there will be dominant political parties there too, typically one conservative and one social democratic. That is going to be the more likely one to produce the prime minister. But those parties will not be able to form typically a government on their own. There will be a coalition government, very likely, in most of these systems. So exactly what the distribution of seats will be in Parliament will have a lot of significance. How well the minor parties do in elections will have a lot of significance for who becomes the prime minister. And they can have quite a substantive influence on how the government is formed after the election, depending on the distribution of seats. And that's an overview of how political parties function and how their functionality impact the political system and the way politics is being done.